Nora Whitmore shoved the last of her firewood into the stove with shaking hands, listening to her youngest son cough in the next room, and told herself for the 100th time that week that tomorrow would be different. It never was. She had 37 cents to her name, 3 children who believed in her completely, and a ranch held together by rote prayer and a stubbornness that the entire town of Harlan Creek had long since stopped trying to understand. Then came the knock. And the man on the other side of that door was about to change everything in ways she could not have survived knowing. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell and follow along until the very last word. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The knock came just after dark. Nora almost didn't answer it. She was on her knees in the kitchen pressing a cool cloth to Tommy's forehead. While he slept fitfully on the cot, she dragged near the stove, and when she heard the sound at the front door, she assumed it was the wind again, the Montana wind that came down off the mountains in November, like it had a personal grudge and rattled every loose board on the property. There were a lot of loose boards. She'd gotten used to the sound. But then it came again. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. She set the cloth down carefully, pulled her shawl tighter, and moved through the dim front room with the kind of quiet that mothers develop after years of not wanting to wake children who'd cried themselves to exhaustion. She picked up the short-handled axe she kept behind the door, not because she was afraid exactly, but because she'd learned that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, and caution was something else entirely. She opened the door 2 inches. The man standing on her porch looked like he'd been dragged behind a horse for 3 days and then left out in the cold to think about it. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, in a way that would have been imposing if he hadn't been swaying slightly on his feet. His coat was dark with moisture. His jaw was set hard, like a man trying to hold himself upright through nothing but willpower. His eyes, when they found hers, were gray, pale gray, like a winter sky, right before a storm decides to get serious. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Neither did she. Then he said, "I don't mean trouble, ma'am. I just need—" And he stopped, and she watched something complicated move across his face. Something that looked like a man swallowing a great deal of pride in one difficult motion. "I just need to sit down somewhere warm, if you've got it to spare." Nora looked at him. She looked at the axe in her hand. She looked back at him. "You armed?" she asked. "Revolver on my hip, rifle on my horse." She appreciated the honesty. A lying man would have said no. "Leave the revolver on the porch rail," she said. "You can keep the rifle where it is. Horse can go in the barn 2nd stall from the left. There's water but no grain." "I'm sorry for that." She stepped back from the door. "Wipe your boots." He blinked at her, like he hadn't expected any of that. Like he'd been bracing for the door to close in his face and was still processing the fact that it hadn't. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "Thank you." His name, he told her 10 minutes later when he was sitting at her kitchen table with a tin cup of coffee warming his hands, was Caleb. Just Caleb. He offered no last name, and she didn't ask for one. That was another thing she'd learned over 6 years of living alone at the edge of everything. You didn't press a man for his story when he was sitting in your kitchen, looking like the world had already pressed him hard enough. She set a bowl of beans and a heel of cornbread in front of him and went back to checking on Tommy. When she came back to the kitchen, the bowl was empty and Caleb was sitting very still, staring at his hands on the table. "Thank you," he said again. The words came out rough, like they cost him something. "It's beans," Nora said, settling into the chair across from him. "Don't thank me too much." Something almost moved his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Best beans I've had in a while. That's either a compliment or a sad commentary on your last few weeks." "Both," he said. She studied him in the lantern light. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe mid-30s, though whatever had happened to him lately had aged him somewhere behind the eyes. His hands were working hands, scarred along the knuckles, calloused in the places that came from rope work and fence posts, not from anything soft. His coat, despite being soaked through, was good quality, or had been once. "You got somewhere to be?" she asked. He was quiet for a beat too long. Not particularly, he said. You can sleep in the barn, Nora said. Dry hay in the loft. I'll leave a blanket on the rail. She rose from the table and began clearing the bowl. Come morning if you've a mind to earn a meal. There's a fence section on the east pasture that needs new posts. I can't pay you in coin. I can pay you in breakfast. He looked at her directly then, and she had the strange sensation that he was seeing her not the way most men in Harlan Creek looked at her, which was with a particular combination of dismissal and contempt that she'd long since decided to simply ignore, but actually seeing her. Like she was a person rather than a problem. I can do that, he said. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. She handed him a folded wool blanket from the trunk by the door and pointed him toward the barn without ceremony. She had 3 children to see to, and a stove to bank down, and about 4 hours of sleep ahead of her if she was fortunate, and she did not have the time or energy to stand in her doorway watching a stranger walk across her yard. But she did for just a moment. She watched him go, leading his horse, his shoulders slightly less rigid than they'd been an hour ago, and she thought, without knowing why, that the man moved like someone carrying something heavy. Not on his back. Somewhere deeper. She closed the door. She went back to Tommy. She did not think about the stranger in her barn again until morning. Chang, Emily, was the first one to see him. She was 12 years old and had her mother's stubbornness and her late father's eyes and an instinct for distrust that Nora privately thought was the most useful quality either of her parents had managed to pass along. She came into the kitchen at first light, with her jaw already set, and said, Mama, there's a man in our barn. I know, Nora said, stirring the porridge. You know. I put him there. Emily stared at her. You put a strange man in our barn. He needed a place to sleep. Mama. He put his gun on the porch rail and he said, please, Nora said. That's more manners than Reverend Holloway showed up with last Sunday, and I fed him a full supper without commentary. Emily opened her mouth, closed it, and then said, I don't like it. You don't have to like it, Nora said, and handed her a bowl. Take this to your brother, and wake your sister. School clothes, both of them. Emily took the bowl with the expression of someone registering a formal protest while accepting that the protest would accomplish nothing, which Nora reflected was basically the correct read of the situation. Caleb appeared at the back door an hour later, hat in hand. He knocked twice and waited. Come in, Nora called. He stepped inside and stopped just past the threshold, the way a careful man does in someone else's home, taking up only the space he'd been given. Fence posts, he said. Where do you want me to start? East pasture. Follow the line until you hit the wash, then work back north. You'll see where the posts are down. There's about 30 feet of fence that's been dragging the ground since October. She set a plate at the table. Eat first. He looked at the plate. Eggs and cornbread, and the last of the salt pork she'd been rationing since the first week of November. You don't have to, he started. I know I don't have to, Nora said. Sit down. He sat. From the doorway, Emily watched him with the focused suspicion of a barn cat regarding a new dog on the property. Caleb noticed. He looked at her steadily and said, Morning, miss. Emily said nothing. Emily, Nora said without turning from the stove. Emily said grudgingly, Morning, and disappeared. Caleb said nothing about the exchange. He ate what was in front of him with the concentrated attention of a man who understood what it meant when a family fed you from a limited supply, and when he was done, he carried his plate to the wash basin without being asked. Set it there carefully and said, I'll start on those posts. He worked until midday without stopping. Nora knew, because she could see him from the kitchen window between tasks moving along the fence line in the gray morning cold. Driving posts with a steady rhythm that suggested both experience and a certain willingness to exhaust himself physically, rather than sit still with whatever was living in his head. She'd known men like that. Her husband had been one of them in his better seasons. Little Tommy found Caleb at noon, which surprised no one who knew Tommy, who operated on the principle that new people were primarily interesting and potentially capable of being won over with sufficient proximity. He was 5 years old and had not yet learned that strangers could be dangerous, possibly because Nora had spent 5 years proving to him that the dangerous ones could be managed and the harmless ones were worth knowing. Nora was bringing a canteen of water and a biscuit out to the pasture when she saw Tommy standing about 3 feet from Caleb, watching him work with total absorption. Caleb had stopped hammering. He was crouched down to Tommy's level, and the two of them appeared to be having a conversation of some gravity. Nora slowed. "Is it hard?" Tommy was asking. "The hammering." "Uh-huh. Not if you hold the post steady first," Caleb said. "If the post moves while you're swinging, you're fighting 2 problems at once. You want to solve one thing at a time." Tommy considered this with the depth of focus that 5-year-olds applied to information that genuinely interested them. "Can I try?" "You'd need to be bigger." "I'm going to be bigger. I believe it," Caleb said, and the gravity in his voice, the complete absence of condescension, made Nora stop walking entirely for a moment. He was talking to Tommy like he was a person, like what Tommy said mattered. "What's your name?" Tommy asked. A half-second pause. "Caleb?" "I'm Tommy." "I know. Your mama told me." "Are you staying?" Another pause. Longer this time. Caleb's jaw moved slightly. "Don't know yet," he said, and his voice had changed not much, but enough that Nora heard it. Something careful in it. Something that was trying very hard to be honest without being cruel. "I've got some things to figure out." "Mama has things to figure out too," Tommy said helpfully. "She figures them out at night when she thinks we're asleep. I hear her sometimes." Nora closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Caleb said nothing for a beat. Then, "She sounds like a smart woman." "She's the smartest," Tommy said with complete confidence. "She fixed the roof by herself. And she knows how to set a broken leg. She set the calf's leg last spring, and it walked just fine after." "Is that right?" "Do you know how to fix things?" Caleb looked at the fence post. "Some things," he said. "Some things I'm not as good at." Nora walked forward and held out the canteen. Caleb stood, accepted it with a nod, and drank. He handed it back and looked out at the line of fence he'd been working and said, "I can finish the east run by nightfall if you've got enough posts. There are 12 more in the barn. That'll do it." "Good," Nora said. And because Tommy was watching, and she was not a woman who wasted words on things that didn't need saying, she simply turned and walked back toward the house. Tommy fell into step beside her, chattering about Caleb and fence posts, and whether the calf remembered having its leg fixed, and Nora listened and answered, and tried not to think about the way the stranger had said some things I'm not as good at, and the look on his face when he said it, like he was confessing something, like the fence posts were the easy problem and the other ones had been sitting on him for a very long time. Grace found him at dusk. Grace was 8, and she was nothing like Emily and nothing like Tommy. She existed in some register all her own, quieter, more observational, with a habit of saying things that made adults go briefly still, because they were more accurate than they had any right to be. She brought Caleb his supper plate to the barn because Nora had said someone should and Emily had refused, and Tommy was already asleep. Nora heard the conversation from the porch where she was mending harness in the last of the evening light. "Mama made rabbit stew," Grace announced, holding the plate out. "She found 3 snares this morning. She checked them before it was even fully light. She does that so we don't go without." "She works hard," Caleb said. "She works harder than anybody in Harlan Creek," Grace said with a matter-of-factness that contained no complaint and no self-pity. "But she cries sometimes, at night. She thinks we're asleep." Silence. "She doesn't cry in front of us," Grace continued. "She says that's not what a mother does, but I think she should be allowed to. Don't you? Everybody should be allowed to." Nora's hands had gone still on the harness. Caleb said very quietly, "Yes, I think they should." "Do you cry?" Grace asked. The pause this time was the longest yet. "I used to," Caleb said. What happened? I ran out, he said, and there was something in those 3 words, a flatness, a hollowness, a quality of something scraped down to bone, that made Nora press her hand against her chest without meaning to. Grace apparently accepted this at face value because she said, Mama says sometimes when you run out of tears, you have to wait for the rain to fill you back up. She says the earth works that way, and maybe people do too. A pause. I think that makes sense. Yeah, Caleb said. It does. You can keep the plate, Grace said. I'll get it in the morning. And she walked back toward the house past where Nora sat, frozen in the near dark, and said, Supper's on the table, Mama, as she went through the door. Nora sat there for another minute. She was not as a rule a woman who allowed herself to form impressions too quickly. 6 years of managing alone had taught her that quick impressions were expensive. They led you to trust when you shouldn't, or to dismiss what deserved a second look. She'd learned to be slow about people, deliberate. But she sat on the porch in the November dark, and she listened to the quiet coming from her barn, and she thought about the way Caleb Holt had crouched down to Tommy's level and talked to him like a person. And the way he'd said some things I'm not as good at with his eyes on the fence post and nowhere near her face. And the way his voice had gone hollow when he said I ran out. And she thought whatever that man is carrying, it is not small. She went inside. She heated Tommy's leftover broth and made Emily drink it, even though Emily said she wasn't cold. She put Grace to bed and listened to Grace say her prayers, which were specific and practical. Grace prayed for the cow's milk to come back in, for the past to stay clear through December, for Tommy's cough to get better. And then added almost as an afterthought, and please look after the man in the barn, because I think he needs it. Nora smoothed her daughter's hair and did not say anything about that. She lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. By the end of the 3rd day, Caleb had repaired the east fence, replaced 2 broken window shutters, rehung the barn door that had been sitting at an angle for 4 months, and dug out the drainage channel along the side of the house that had been flooding the root cellar every time it rained. He hadn't been asked to do any of it after the first job. He just did it. Nora watched this with the same careful attention she gave to all things she didn't yet understand. She fed him, and she didn't ask him to leave, and she didn't ask him to stay, and she tried not to make anything of the fact that the ranch was beginning to feel for the first time in a long time, like it had more than one person fighting for it. On the 4th morning, she was in the yard drawing water when she heard horses coming up the track. 3 riders. She recognized 2 of them. Hank Dressler, who ran the feed store and had been offering to buy her grazing rights for 2 years with a persistence that had graduated from annoying to concerning. And beside him the Meeks brothers, who weren't known for much except making themselves useful to whoever in Harlan Creek needed something done without it being talked about afterward. She kept drawing water. Dressler pulled up and looked down at her from his horse with that particular expression she'd grown to despise, not quite contempt, not quite pity. Something that combined both into something worse than either. "Mornin', Nora," he said. "See you're still out here keeping the place warm." "Morning," she said. "Heard you've had some company." Dressler said, his eyes moving over the yard. "Neighbor saw a strange horse in your barn." "Hired hand," Nora said. "Is that right?" He didn't believe her. She could hear it in the flatness of his voice. "Funny. Didn't know you had coin to hire with." "I pay in meals," she said. "Last I checked, that was legal in Montana." Dressler's mouth did something unpleasant. "You know, Nora, you've been a real determined woman out here. I'll give you that. But winter's coming hard this year, and that north pasture's going to flood again, and a woman in your situation," he let the pause do work the way men like him always did, "might want to think about more permanent arrangements. My offer stands. I'll give you fair price for the grazing rights, enough to get you and those kids through to spring." "Your offer's been declined 3 times, Nora said. "I expect it'll be declined a 4th. "That's what I admire about you," Dressler said, and he did not sound like he admired anything. "Stubborn as a fence post. Course a fence post doesn't have 3 mouths to feed through January." "Thank you for stopping by," Nora said. Dressler looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "You know this place can't hold forever, Nora. At some point you're going to have to be practical. "I've been practical every single day for 6 years," she said. "I don't find it requires your encouragement." He clicked his tongue at his horse, and the three of them turned and rode back down the track. Nora stood at the well and watched them go, and kept her face very still and her hands very steady, and did not let herself feel anything until they were far enough gone that it didn't matter. She felt quite a lot then for about 30 seconds. She set the bucket down and pressed her hands against the side of the well and breathed. She didn't hear Caleb come across the yard. She didn't hear him at all until he was standing about 5 feet behind her and said quietly, "You all right?" She didn't startle. She'd heard enough of Dressler to last a lifetime and wasn't wasting whatever was left in her on being startled by a different man. "Fine," she said. "Who was that?" "Man who wants my grazing rights." She picked the bucket back up. "He comes by every few months to remind me that a woman alone is a weakness waiting to be exploited." Caleb was quiet. "He's been at it long enough that it barely registers anymore," Nora said, and started back toward the house. "Does it register at all?" She stopped walking. She thought about that. "More than I let it," she said finally, without turning around. "Less than it used to." She started walking again. "There's oats soaking for breakfast. Half an hour." She went inside. She didn't see the expression on Caleb's face as he stood in her yard watching her go. She didn't see his jaw tighten, or his hands close slowly at his sides, or the way his eyes moved down the track where Dressler had ridden steadily with a coldness that had nothing to do with the November air. She didn't see any of it. She didn't know yet that Caleb Holt was not staying at her ranch because he had nowhere else to go. She didn't know about the document folded in the inner pocket of his coat, the document that had traveled with him from a lawyer's office in Billings, the document he'd carried for 9 months before he finally found enough nerve to do what he'd told himself he was going to do. She didn't know that the ranch she had bled for and begged for and starved for and built board by board back from the wreckage of a grief that wasn't even hers was legally, irrevocably, and entirely his. She didn't know that Caleb Holt had ridden to Harlan Creek with a plan. And she didn't know that every day he stayed every bowl of beans she fed him and every fence post he drove, and every moment Tommy laughed on his shoulders, and Grace said prayers for him, and Emily watched him from the doorway, with eyes that wanted very badly not to trust him, but weren't sure anymore. They could manage it. Every single one of those moments was making his plan harder to remember why he'd had it in the first place. The document sat in his coat pocket every hour of every day, heavy as stone, heavy as everything he hadn't said. He didn't sleep that night. Caleb lay in the barn loft with his coat folded under his head, the coat with the document in the inner pocket, and stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the ranch breathe around him. The horse shifted below. Wind moved along the eaves. Somewhere in the house a child coughed once and went quiet. He'd been in that loft 4 nights now. He'd told himself 1, then 2. Then he'd stopped counting and started noticing other things instead, which was a problem he hadn't anticipated and didn't know what to do with. He pressed his forearm over his eyes and thought about the lawyer's office in Billings. About how clean and simple it had seemed in September, sitting across the desk from a man in a wool suit who laid the papers out and explained the situation with the measured efficiency of someone who dealt in property and not in people. The ranch had been in Caleb's name for 11 years. The widow living on it had no legal claim. A letter had been sent 3 years prior, the lawyer had documentation, and if no response had been received, that was a matter of circumstance, not obligation. The land could be sold. The debt could be cleared. And Caleb Holt could stop carrying something that had no use to a man who planned to keep moving. It had made sense in that office. It made considerably less sense when he thought about Nora pressing her hands against the side of the well and breathing like a woman who was holding the entire weight of her life in her chest, by force of will alone, and had been doing it so long she'd forgotten it was supposed to be hard. He reached into the coat and pulled out the document without unfolding it. He held it in the dark. He put it back. He didn't sleep. Shots. Morning came fast and cold, and with it came Emily. She appeared at the barn door at 6:30 with a tin cup of coffee held out at arm's length, like she was feeding something she hadn't entirely decided was domesticated. Caleb took it. "Thank you." Emily said nothing. She leaned against the doorframe and watched him with those sharp dark eyes, and let the silence sit there between them the way the young did when they were working something out and didn't want to be rushed about it. He drank the coffee. "You fixed the door," Emily said finally. "It was binding." "It's been binding for 2 years." "I know," Caleb said, and then because he hadn't meant to say that, he said, "I could see the marks, where it dragged." Emily looked at him steadily. "Mama tried to fix it herself, last spring. She got the hinge off, and then the wood cracked, and she spent 2 hours on it and couldn't get it right. She didn't say anything about it. She just left it." He said nothing. "She doesn't ask for help," Emily said, and the way she said it carried about 15 years' worth of meaning for a 12-year-old. "Not from anybody. She thinks asking makes her look like she can't manage." "She manages fine," Caleb said. "I know she does." Emily's jaw tightened slightly. "That's not the point." He looked at her. She looked back at him. She was going to be formidable when she grew up. She was already most of the way there. "What is the point?" he asked. "The point," Emily said with the precision of someone who had spent considerable time constructing this sentence before delivering it, "is that she does everything alone, and she has for a long time. And I'm old enough to help, but I'm not old enough to help with everything. And Tommy is 5. And Grace means well, but Grace lives half her life in her own head." She stopped. "So we manage. But managing isn't the same as being all right." The silence after that was the kind that required nothing added to it. "Why are you telling me this?" Caleb asked. Emily considered him for a long moment. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'm still deciding whether you're worth telling." She pushed off the doorframe. "Breakfast is in 20 minutes." She walked back toward the house. Caleb sat with the empty coffee cup and the weight in his coat pocket, and the specific discomfort of a man who had just been evaluated by a child and was not entirely sure he'd passed. The trouble came before noon, and it came in the form of 2 women from town. Nora was in the yard when they rode up Martha Pruitt and her sister-in-law Clara, both wives of men on the town council, both wearing that particular brand of concern that was mostly performance and mostly about something else underneath. "Nora," Martha said, climbing down with the careful movements of someone who considered themselves to be doing charity work. "We just came to check on you. We heard you've had a man staying here." "Hired hand?" Nora said the same thing she'd told Dressler. Martha looked at Clara. Clara looked at Martha. The exchange was a whole conversation accomplished in 1 second. "Well, you know how people talk, Nora. A woman alone, a strange man on the property. We just thought you should know that people are concerned." "People are curious," Nora said pleasantly. "That's a different thing." "It reflects on the children," Clara said, and she said it softly, which was worse than if she'd said it hard. Nora went very still. "I beg your pardon," she said. "We only mean well. You've worked so hard. You've done remarkable things out here, really. But a woman in your situation—" Clara's eyes moved over Nora in a way that managed to take in her weight and her worn dress and her general state all in one smooth motion. "Needs to be careful about appearances." "Clara," Nora said, and her voice had dropped about half an octave and was now occupying a register that her children would have recognized immediately as requiring immediate attention and probably retreat. "I'm going to ask you something sincerely. Have you ever spent a night in a house where you weren't sure you'd have enough to feed your children in the morning?" Clara blinked. "Well, have you ever set a fence post in frozen ground? Delivered a calf alone in January? Patched a roof in November because if the rain got into the walls, the plaster would go, and then the cold would get to the children's bedroom?" Nora's voice was level. She was not raising it. She was doing something much more controlled and much more dangerous than raising it. "Have you done any of those things, Clara? Either of you?" Martha said stiffly. "Nora, we're only trying to—" I know what you're trying to do, Nora said. You're trying to make me feel like I need your approval to run my own ranch. I don't. I haven't for 6 years. The man in my barn works hard, speaks politely to my children, and hasn't given me a single moment of trouble. Which is more than I can say for some of the people in this town who've ridden up my drive with opinions. She looked from one to the other. Thank you for coming by. You be safe riding back. She turned and walked toward the house. Behind her she heard Clara whisper something to Martha, and Martha whisper something back, and Nora kept walking, and kept her face forward, and did not let any of it land on her, until she was through the back door, and standing at the kitchen sink, with both hands gripping the edge. She stood there for a minute. Caleb came through the back door. He'd been near enough to hear it, she could tell by the way he stopped just inside, and read the room in one glance, and didn't say anything at all. Which was, she discovered, exactly the right thing to do. "Those women are going to talk," she said to the window. "Probably," he said. "They already are." She released the edge of the sink. "They're going to make it difficult. For you too if you're still here." She turned around. "I'm not telling you to leave. I'm telling you what staying costs." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his gray eyes, something that was working very hard in a space she couldn't see, arriving at a conclusion she wasn't privy to. "I've been told what staying costs before," he said. It didn't take. Nora looked at him. He looked back at her steady and plain-faced, and she had the uncomfortable sensation, the same one she'd had that first night at the door, the same one she kept having and kept choosing not to examine too closely, that there were at least 2 conversations happening simultaneously when she talked to this man, and she was only party to one of them. "All right then," she said. "There's fence work on the south line." "I'll get to it," he said, and went back out. Odd. Tommy's cough got worse by evening. Nora knew the sound. She'd been listening to it for 3 nights, cataloging it, the way mothers catalog these things, tracking whether it was deepening or staying shallow. It was deepening. She sat on the edge of his cot and pressed her ear against his small chest and listened and kept her face neutral so he wouldn't see anything to be afraid of. "Mama," Tommy said around a wheeze. "Does my chest sound like a drum?" "More like a fiddle," Nora said. "A fiddle that needs tuning." "Can you tune it?" "Working on it," she said. She had no medicine. She had dried eucalyptus she'd traded for in September, and a mustard plaster recipe she knew by heart, and enough firewood to keep the room warm through the night. She had those things, and she had the knowledge of what it sounded like when a child's cough crossed a line she needed to worry about, and she was right at the edge of that line, and she knew it. She was heating water on the stove, moving quietly so she wouldn't wake Emily and Grace, when she heard the back door open. Caleb. He stopped when he saw her. "Tommy," he asked. "Cough's getting deeper," she said without slowing. "I'm making a steam treatment." He came to the stove. He stood beside her and looked at the pot, and then said, "You got any pine pitch?" She looked at him. "What?" "Pine pitch, in the steam. My mother used it when I was small. I don't know if it works or if it was just the steam, but she swore by it." He was looking at the pot, not at her. "There's a pine split in the woodpile. I saw the pitch seeping on the cut end." Nora thought about it for 3 seconds. "Get it," she said. He came back with a piece of split pine with the gold amber pitch still wet on the cut face, and she set it near the pot, not in it close enough for the warmth to release the resin into the steam, and they stood in the kitchen in the middle of the night, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say. That was more important than listening to the pot and watching the steam and waiting. After a few minutes, she took the bowl into Tommy's room and held it near enough for him to breathe without scalding, and she sat there in the dark and counted his breaths and listened to them slowly, slowly, over the course of an hour, begin to ease. When she came back to the kitchen, Caleb was still there. He was sitting at the table with his coat on the chair beside him, and his hands were flat on the table, and he was looking at something in the middle distance that had nothing to do with the kitchen. She poured 2 cups of coffee from what was left in the pot and set one in front of him without asking. He picked it up. "Thank you," she said, "for the pine." I don't know if it was the pine. I think it was, she said. And even if it wasn't, she stopped, and then she said the rest of it because she was too tired to be indirect about it. It helped to not be the only one standing at the stove. It's been a long time since I wasn't the only one standing at the stove. Caleb's hands tightened slightly around the cup. She didn't see it. She was looking at her coffee. You do this alone every time? He asked. Every time, she said. And the children's father. 3 years ago. Heart gave out in February. She said it plainly the way she'd learned to say it, not because it didn't hurt, but because she'd said it enough times that she could now place it where it needed to go without letting it take over the whole room. He was a decent man. He tried hard. He wasn't built for this, maybe. The hardship got to him in ways I didn't see until it was too late. She looked at her hands around the cup. I don't blame him. Not anymore. Do you blame yourself? Caleb asked. The question surprised her. Most people didn't ask that. Sometimes, she said honestly, for not seeing it sooner, for thinking that if I just worked harder, kept things going well enough, it would be enough for him. She shook her head. You can't love someone out of a thing they've decided to carry alone. The silence that came after that was different from the others. It landed, and she watched Caleb sit very still inside it with an expression she couldn't quite name, somewhere between recognition and something that was almost grief, but a grief that had dried out long ago and was now just the shape grief left behind when it was done with a person. No, he said. You can't. His voice was different when he said it. Emptied out. Like he'd said the same thing to himself before in a different context, and the answer had cost him something significant. Nora looked at him. She wanted to ask. She could feel the question sitting at the back of her throat, warm and present. She didn't ask. She'd learned that too, that some things came in their own time, or didn't come at all, and pressing never made them come faster. Get some sleep, she said instead. There's the south fence line in the morning. Caleb nodded. He picked up his coat and stood, and he stopped at the door and said without turning, He would have been 3 next month. Nora went still. My son, Caleb said. He would have been 3. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't make a sound because she understood instinctively that this was a thing being set down in a room, and it needed space to land properly. I'm sorry, she said finally, quietly. He nodded once. He went out into the cold, and Nora sat alone at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup and the steam rising slowly between her fingers, and she thought about a man who had run out of tears and was waiting for the rain to fill him back up. And she thought about a son who would have been 3 next month, and she thought about the way grief changed a person's shape from the inside out, until they fit differently in every room they walked into. She thought about all of that for a long time. She did not yet think about the coat he'd left on the chair for 3 seconds before picking it up. She did not think about the faint crinkle of folded paper from the inner pocket when he'd reached for it. She didn't think about any of that. Not yet. She found out on a Tuesday. She hadn't planned to go into Harlan Creek that week. She'd been rationing the trips, rationing everything, spreading each errand, thin enough to last. But Tommy needed medicine, and the eucalyptus was gone, and she'd woken up that morning listening to his chest, and decided the cough had reached a threshold she wasn't willing to negotiate with anymore. She left Emily in charge and rode in alone. The pharmacy was at the end of the main street, 2 doors past the feed store, and she was almost to it when she heard Dressler's voice coming from inside the feed store doorway, low and satisfied, the voice of a man who was telling good news to someone who wanted to hear it. She didn't mean to stop, but she heard her name. Whitmore Place'll go to auction by the first week of December. Lawyer in Billings confirmed it. Whoever holds the deed comes to collect the widow's got no standing. 30 days notice, which went out 3 weeks ago if the documentation's right. Another voice, one she didn't recognize. You putting in a bid? I intend to be the only bid, Dressler said, and she could hear the smile in it. Thick and self-satisfied, the smile of a man who'd been patient a long time and was finally watching his patience pay off. Nora stood on the boardwalk and did not move. 30 days notice, 3 weeks ago, first week of December. Someone held the deed to her ranch. Someone had always held the deed to her ranch. Her hands had gone cold inside her gloves. She pressed them against her sides and made herself breathe through her nose slow and even, the way she breathed when something was happening that required her to stay functional. She was good at that. She'd had a lot of practice. She went to the pharmacy. She bought the medicine. She spoke normally to the pharmacist, responded to his questions about the children, said yes, it was getting cold early this year, said goodbye with a steady voice. She rode home without remembering any of the road. Caleb was splitting wood at the side of the house when she got back. He heard her come into the yard and looked up, and she watched him read her face in 1 second. Flat. She saw it happen, saw the particular stillness that came over him, the kind of stillness that wasn't calm, but was the thing that sat right next to calm and looked like it from a distance. She dismounted without speaking. She handed him the reins without looking at him. She went inside. Emily came out of the kitchen and started to say something about lunch, and Nora held up one hand, and Emily, who was 12 years old and had her mother's instincts in full working order, stopped talking immediately and found somewhere else to be. Nora stood in the front room. She stood there for a while. She heard Caleb come in through the back. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. She heard the specific quality of silence that was a man trying to figure out what was happening and how bad it was. "There's going to be an auction," she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. "Someone holds the deed to this ranch. Dressler's been waiting for them to come collect. 30 days notice went out 3 weeks ago." She turned around. "Do you know anything about that?" Caleb looked at her, and she knew. She knew before he said a single word. She knew from the way the color changed in his face, and the way his jaw set, and the way his hands went very still at his sides. And she knew from every small thing she'd filed away in the last 10 days without meaning to. The way he knew the barn without being shown around it. The way he'd said some things I'm not as good at about fixing things when he'd been fixing everything on this property, with the ease of a man who knew exactly where every board was supposed to go. The way he'd looked at the house sometimes in the evenings when he didn't know she was watching him, like he was looking at something that used to be his. "Caleb," she said, and her voice had changed. The evenness was still there, but something underneath it had cracked clean through. "Tell me right now." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He put the document on the table between them. Nora looked at it. She looked at him. She looked back at it. She crossed the room and picked it up and unfolded it and read it, and the words were exactly what she'd known they were going to be from the moment she'd seen his face in the doorway. The deed to the Holt Ranch, Harlan Creek, Montana Territory. Every acre. The house, the barn, the pastures, the water rights. All of it. In the name of Caleb Jedediah Holt. The paper in her hands was dated 11 years ago. She had been living on this land for 6. She set the paper back down on the table carefully. She smoothed it flat with 2 fingers. She stepped back. "How long," she said, "have you known?" "Since I rode up the drive," he said. The silence that came out of that was not like the other silences they'd had in this kitchen. It was a different kind entirely, the kind with edges. "You sat at my table," she said. "Yes." "You ate my food." "Yes." "My children." Her voice broke on that just once, and she stopped and pulled it back. "My children talked to you. They told you things. Grace told you." She stopped again. "You let them. Knowing." "Yes," he said, and the word cost him something she could see. "Why?" she asked. Why didn't you tell me the first night? The first morning? Why did you?" She pressed her hand flat against the table. "Why did you fix the door, Caleb? Why did you sit with Tommy in the middle of the night? Why did you?" "Because I couldn't," he said. "I couldn't say it. Every time I tried." "You didn't try?" she said. Her voice went sharp and quiet and clean as a blade. "Don't tell me you tried. A man who is trying says the words. He doesn't fix the fences and eat the supper and let the children." She stopped, and her whole chest was moving, and she turned away from him and faced the wall, because she could not at this moment in her life afford to let him see her face. "Nora, don't," she said. "Don't say my name right now." The quiet between them was terrible. She had been through hard things. She had inventoried them privately in the way you did when life kept adding to the list. The winter her husband took to the bottle, the February he died the morning she buried the livestock during the blizzard, with no one to help her carry them, the night she sat at this very table and counted 43 cents, and did the arithmetic of feeding 3 children through March. She had been through hard things, and she had not broken under any of them. She had thought somewhere in the last 10 days, in the margins of her ordinary days, in the parts of herself she didn't examine too directly, she had thought that maybe the stranger at her door was something different. Not a rescue. She didn't need rescue. But something like company. Something like proof that the world still occasionally sent something toward her that wasn't loss. She had been wrong. "I came here to sell it," Caleb said from behind her. "That was the plan. Clear the debt. Be done with it. I hadn't been back in 5 years. I told myself it was just property." She said nothing. "And then I got here," he said, "and there were children in the yard, and the garden, and the house." He stopped, and she heard something shift in his voice, something that was moving toward the edge of something much older than this conversation. "The house was alive. I hadn't expected it to be alive." "It's alive because I made it alive," she said, still facing the wall, "board by board, year by year, while you were somewhere else being done with it. I know that. Do you—" She turned around. "Do you understand what I built here? Not just the fences and the garden? The life I built for my children in a place this town told me I had no right to be. The dignity I held on to while people like Clara Meeks looked me up and down and told me I was a problem waiting to be managed." Her voice was rising now, controlled, but rising the way a fire got when it finally had air. "I have been mocked and dismissed and treated like a squatter and a burden, and worse, and I kept going because this—" She pressed her hand flat against the wall. "This was mine. I earned it, not on paper, but in every way that matters to a person who has to wake up every single morning and choose to keep going." Caleb stood across the table from her, and he didn't look away, and he didn't offer her anything soft or deflecting, and she was glad for that because she would have thrown it back at him. "I know," he said. "Stop saying that." "I know it doesn't help." "Then what does?" she said. "What are you giving me right now that helps? Are you selling it? Is the auction still happening? Are my children going to wake up in December and be put out in the cold because—" "No," he said, fast, hard, like a door slamming. "No, I'm not selling it. I'm not. I'm not." She stared at him. "I came here to sell it, and I'm not going to," he said, and he said it like a man who'd only just in this moment finished deciding it, and maybe that was exactly what was happening. "But I should have told you. Day one. I should have—" He pressed his hand across his face. "I kept telling myself there was a right moment, and there wasn't a right moment. There was never going to be a right moment, and every day it got harder to—" "Why did you leave?" she said. "In the first place, 5 years ago." He went still. She had known from Grace's report of their conversation in the barn that there was something there. She had waited the way she waited for everything for him to bring it in his own time. She was done waiting. "There was a fire," he said, and the way he said it, the absolute flatness of it, the compression of years of unspoken grief into 4 words made her stop moving entirely. "My wife," he said, "and our boy. I was in Billings. I'd gone for supplies. 3 days. When I came back—" He stopped. He started again. The south wall of the house, some ember from the stove. They couldn't— He stopped again, and this time he didn't start again. He just stood there with whatever was left of the sentence sitting inside him somewhere she couldn't reach. Nora put her hand over her mouth. "He was 14 months old," Caleb said. "My son, 14 months. He would have been 3 next month." She heard herself say it, and she remembered where she'd first heard it, and the timeline assembled itself in her mind. Without mercy, he had come back to a ranch that had burned his family. He had come back to a house that a stranger had rebuilt from the same foundation where he'd lost everything. He had come back to children laughing in a yard where his child had died. "You came back here," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have left," he said. "The way I left. I got on my horse and I rode and I didn't stop. I couldn't be here. I couldn't be anywhere near here." He looked at his hands. "I left the property in trust with the lawyer's office. I sent a letter 3 years later about the deed situation. I was told a family was living on it. I thought I told myself that was fine, that they could stay until I sorted myself out. And then I never sorted myself out. And then it had been 5 years and there was debt building and the lawyer said I needed to make a decision. So you came," Nora said. "So I came," he said, "with a plan." They stood in the kitchen where she had fed him beans on his first night and where he had helped her with the pine pitch and the steam at 2 a.m, and the document was on the table between them, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. "Why are you telling me now?" she said. "Because you deserve to know," he said, "and because you found out anyway. And because—" He stopped. "Because what?" He looked at her directly the way he did when he meant something that he couldn't afford to understate. "Because I watched you stand at that well after Dressler left," he said, "and hold everything together with your bare hands, and I have been sitting on this for 10 days like a coward, and you deserve better than that. Whatever I owe you, and I know I owe you something, you deserve at least the truth." Nora looked at him for a long time. She thought about Grace planting things, about Tommy on his shoulders, about Emily watching him from doorways with suspicious eyes that were losing the battle against something that looked like trust. She thought about all the things she'd built in this house, and all the things she still had no idea she was standing in the middle of. "Get out," she said quietly. "Tonight. I need you out of this house tonight." Something crossed his face. He absorbed it. He nodded. "Okay," he said. He picked up the document from the table. He folded it and put it back in his coat. He went to the door and he stopped with his hand on the frame and he said, "I'm not selling it, Nora. Whatever you think of me, that's not changing." She said nothing. He went out into the cold, and Nora stood alone in her kitchen and looked at the table where he'd sat, and the wall she'd pressed her hand against, and the stove where they'd stood together at 2 a.m. while Tommy breathed easier. And for the first time in 3 years, she sat down in the chair and covered her face with both hands and let herself cry like a woman who had been holding the entire world on her back for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down even for a moment. She cried for a long time. Nobody saw her. That was the worst part. Nobody ever saw her. She didn't sleep. She lay on her side in the dark and listened to the house. Tommy's breathing steadier now. Grace shifting in her sleep. The old settle and creak of walls. She knew by sound, the way she knew her children's voices. And she stared at the wall and tried to think clearly about what came next. What came next was December. What came next was 30 days minus 3 weeks. What came next was Dressler at the auction and nobody on her side of the table. She had no legal claim to this land. She'd known that abstractly the way you knew things. You never let yourself look at directly the way you knew a tooth was going bad, but kept chewing on the other side and not making the appointment. She'd never had the money to consult a lawyer. She'd told herself the previous owner was gone and the ranch was abandoned and she was maintaining it, and there was common law precedent for that kind of thing. She'd told herself a lot of things. None of them were in writing. The document in Caleb's coat was in writing. She got up before dawn and started coffee and tried to be practical. Caleb was gone. She'd told him to go, and he'd gone, and she was not going to spend energy regretting that, because she'd meant it, and she'd been right to mean it, and the fact that the kitchen felt different this morning was not relevant information. The fact that she kept not looking at the chair where he usually sat was not relevant information. She was a practical woman, and she had practical problems, and she was going to address them one at a time. The first problem was the children. She was going to have to tell Emily. Emily, who was 12 and old enough to understand what losing the ranch meant, and old enough to have known something was wrong the moment Nora had walked in yesterday with that face and had not pressed her, which was an act of restraint that Nora appreciated more than she could say. She was reaching for her coffee cup when she heard the horse, not from the barn, from the track, coming in. She set the cup down and went to the window. The man riding up her track at 6 in the morning on a November Tuesday was Derek Whitmore, and the sight of him turned something cold in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her late husband's brother. He'd never liked her, not before the wedding, and not after it, and not after the funeral which he'd attended with the specific manner of a man calculating what he was owed from a death. He lived in Billings, and showed up in Harlan Creek occasionally, and every time he did, he left behind some new complication. Last time 8 months ago, he'd told her she was raising the children wrong. The time before that, he'd suggested that Grace would be better off sent east to his wife's family for schooling. The time before that, he'd offered to take the ranch off her hands for a sum she recognized as insultingly low, and told her to be grateful for the offer. She went to the back of the house and pulled on her coat. She met him in the yard. "Derek," she said. He climbed down from his horse with that deliberate unhurriedness that was its own kind of statement. He was a lean, sharp-featured man with their family's eyes, which had looked better on her husband and didn't suit Derek at all. Nora. His eyes moved over the yard, over the repaired barn door, the fresh fence posts visible along the east line. "I heard you had a man working the place." "I had a hired hand," she said. "He's gone." "Is he?" He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the one that meant he already knew things he was going to pretend to discover. "I also heard about the deed situation." Her jaw tightened. "Word travels fast. It does when people talk to the right folks." He pulled his gloves off one finger at a time. "Here's the thing, Nora. I've been patient with you. 3 years patient. You're out here by yourself with 3 children and no money, and no legal standing on the only property you've got, and I've let you manage it in your own way, because I figured you needed the time." "That's generous of you," she said flatly. "But December's coming," he said. "And when that auction happens, you're going to be standing in the cold with 3 kids and nowhere to go. Now, I have a solution." "I don't need your solutions. Hear me out." He held up a hand. "My wife and I have discussed it. We'll take the children, all 3. Emily's old enough to be useful around the house. Grace is sweet enough, and Tommy." He waved a hand. "Boys are easy at that age. They'll have a proper roof and proper meals and proper schooling, and you—" His eyes moved over her in the same way Clara Meeks's had, with that smooth, encompassing dismissal. "You'll be free to figure out your situation without the burden of—" "Stop," Nora said. "Nora?" "I said stop." Her voice was quiet and absolute, and she took one step toward him. "You are standing in my yard at 6 in the morning offering to take my children from me and calling it a solution. My children are not a burden. My children are not a complication in my situation. They are my life. Derek, and you will not come onto this property again and speak about them that way." He looked at her with the cold patience of a man who'd decided to wait her out. "You won't have a choice," he said. "When the ranch goes—" "The ranch isn't going." The voice came from behind her. Nora turned. Caleb was standing at the corner of the house. He hadn't gone far then, or he'd come back. She didn't know which, and she found that right now she didn't care. He was there, and he was looking at Derek Whitmore with those pale gray eyes gone completely flat, and he walked forward into the yard with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had decided exactly what he was doing and had no intention of being argued out of it. Derek looked at him. "And you are?" "Caleb Holt," he said. "I own this ranch." The silence that followed was the kind that rearranged things. Derek's face went through several calculations rapidly. "You're the deed holder." "I am." "Then you're the one selling." "I'm not selling," Caleb said. "The auction's being canceled. I'm riding to Billings this week to settle the debt and file the paperwork removing the property from any pending sale. This ranch is not available." He stopped a few feet from Derek and looked at him steadily. And the woman and children on it aren't available either. Not to you, not to Dressler, not to anybody with designs on what's been built here. Derek turned to Nora. You know this man. Yes, Nora said. She was watching Caleb. And you're what? Partners. He said the word with a texture that made it something other than its meaning. She is the person who kept this ranch alive for 6 years, Caleb said before Nora could respond. He said it without heat, just fact the way you stated coordinates. She repaired what was broken. She built what was missing. She raised 3 children on this land with no help from anyone. Whatever she is or isn't to me is none of your business. His voice lowered slightly. What I can tell you is that you will not stand in this yard and offer to divide up her family like she's not standing right here. Not today. Not again. Derek looked at him for a long moment. He was the kind of man who was always weighing angles, and Nora could see him working through this one, checking it from different sides. You're serious, Derek said. I've never been less serious in my life, Caleb said. This is the most serious I've been in 5 years. Another silence. Derek pulled his gloves back on slowly. I'll be talking to my lawyer, Derek said. You're welcome to, Caleb said. Tell him to reach out to James Aldridge in Billings. He holds the deed documentation. It's straightforward. Derek looked at Nora one last time. There was something in it, not quite threat, not quite warning, something that sat between them and wanted her to know it was still there. You're making a mistake, he said to her, trusting a stranger over family. You've never been family, Nora said quietly. You've been an obligation. There's a difference. He mounted his horse. He rode out without looking back. Nora and Caleb stood in the yard and listened to the hoofbeats fade. Then she turned to him. You came back, she said. I didn't go far, he said. I told you to leave. You told me to be out of the house, he said. I slept under the cottonwood. A pause. It was cold. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and then she turned toward the house. Coffee's on, she said. He followed her in. Emily was at the kitchen table when they came through the door. She looked at Caleb, then at her mother, then back at Caleb, and her expression did the kind of rapid, sophisticated processing that made Nora simultaneously proud of her and exhausted by her. You're back, Emily said. I'm back, Caleb said. What happened outside? Derek came, Nora said, pouring the coffee. Emily's jaw tightened. She hated Derek the way only a 12-year-old who fully understood a situation could hate someone cleanly and completely and without any diplomatic softening. What did he want? The usual, Nora said. He wanted to take us, Emily said flatly, not a question. Nora looked at her. He suggested it. What did you say? I said no. Nora set a cup in front of Caleb. Caleb said some things too. Emily looked at Caleb with those dark, evaluating eyes. What did you say? She asked him. Caleb wrapped his hands around the cup. I told him this ranch wasn't for sale and the people on it weren't his business. Emily was quiet for a moment. Are you the one who owns it? She said. The deed. Caleb looked at Nora. Nora said, yes. Emily absorbed this, the way she absorbed difficult things, not with explosion, but with a kind of concentrated stillness, like she was pressing it flat and examining it from all sides. You knew the whole time, Emily said to Caleb. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact being confirmed. Yes, he said. And you didn't tell us. No. That wasn't right, Emily said. No, he said. It wasn't. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at her mother. Are we going to be okay? She asked. And for a moment she wasn't 12 years old, and managing the situation she was 12 years old and needed to know. Nora reached across the table and put her hand over Emily's. Yes, she said. Emily looked at Caleb. He said yes. Emily nodded once, tight and decisive, and picked up her coffee and said, I'll get Tommy and Grace up for breakfast then. and went down the hall. Caleb looked at the hallway she'd disappeared into. "She's going to be something," he said. "She already is," Nora said. Jog. He rode to Billings 3 days later. He was gone for a week, and it was the longest week Nora had spent in recent memory. Not because she couldn't manage alone. She could. She always could. But because the house had adjusted to having him in it, and now adjusted back with a kind of grumbling reluctance, she chose not to examine. Tommy asked where he was every morning. Grace said nothing, but kept looking at the barn door. Emily did not ask, and did not look at the barn door, which was its own form of looking at the barn door. He came back on a Thursday afternoon with 2 things: a receipt from the Billings lawyer's office, confirming the auction had been withdrawn, and a second document new dated that week, that Nora didn't understand until he set it in front of her on the kitchen table, and she read it twice. "What is this?" she said. "Homestead protection," he said. "It means that regardless of what happens to the deed, regardless of anything, you and the children have legal right to occupancy of this property. It's registered with the county. Dressler can't touch it. Derek can't touch it. It's yours." She looked at the document. She looked at him. "You gave me legal standing," she said. "I should have done it 3 years ago when the lawyer told me someone was living here," he said. "I should have done a lot of things 3 years ago." He sat down across from her, the same way he'd sat on the first night, both hands on the table direct. "I can't undo what I didn't do. But I can do this." She looked back at the document. Her name was on it. Nora Whitmore. Right to occupancy. Right to work the land, right to remain. 6 years she'd been here without a single piece of paper saying she had any right to any of it. "This doesn't," she started and stopped and tried again. "This doesn't fix what you did, the 10 days you knew." "I know. I trusted you," she said. "I let my children trust you. That's not a small thing. I know it isn't. Why should I?" She stopped again. "I'm not asking you to do anything," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, or think better of me, or—" He pressed his hand flat on the table. "I just need you to know that I didn't come back to Harlan Creek for the land. I know I thought I did, but the land isn't what's kept me here." The kitchen was very quiet. "What's kept you here?" she said, and it wasn't quite a question. He looked at her, steady and plain and without anything hidden. "You know what's kept me here," he said. She did know. She'd known for days if she was honest, which she generally tried to be. She'd known from the pine pitch at 2 in the morning, and from the way he talked to Tommy, and from the way he'd stood in her yard and told Derek Whitmore that what she was to him was none of his business. Said it like it meant something definite, even though nothing definite had been said. "You can't just," she started. "I know I can't just," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm asking you to let me stay, not in the house, in the barn, working the ranch, being here." He stopped. "That's all I'm asking." She looked at him across the table that had seen 6 years of her life and 10 days of his. "The south fence line still needs work on the lower section," she said. Something in his face shifted. Not a smile exactly. Something older and more careful than a smile. "I'll get to it in the morning," he said. "And the barn roof on the east side is going to go before the first heavy snow. I'll look at it this week. And I'm not—" She stopped and started again. "I'm not a quick thing, Caleb. Whatever you're thinking about what this might be, I'm not built for quick. I've got 3 children and a ranch and about 40 other things that come before my own feelings, and I don't have the time or energy to pretend otherwise. I'm not in a hurry," he said, and something in the way he said it, the quiet completeness of it, the sense of a man who had been running for 5 years and had finally in some essential way stopped, made her believe him. "All right," she said. She picked up the homestead document and folded it carefully. She carried it to the tin box on the shelf, where she kept the important papers. Tommy's birth record, Emily's school certificates, the letter from the land office she'd received years ago that said exactly nothing helpful, and she placed it inside and closed the lid. She came back to the table and sat down. "I'll need more coffee if we're going to talk about the barn roof," she said. Caleb got up and poured it. Neither of them said anything about the fact that he knew where the cups were without looking. Neither of them said anything about the fact that he moved through her kitchen the way a man moved through a place he'd stopped being a guest in, quiet and careful and familiar. Neither of them said anything about Grace appearing in the doorway for approximately 4 seconds, seeing both of them at the table, and retreating back down the hall with the satisfied expression of someone whose prayer had been specifically answered. They talked about the barn roof. They talked for a long time. Outside, the first real snow of November began to fall soft and steady over the Harlan Creek Valley, over the east fence line with its new posts over the garden Nora had built from nothing, over the old foundation at the far south end of the property, where something had burned once and been mourned, and over the ranch that had been in the same season both an ending and a beginning, depending entirely on where you were standing when you looked at it. December came and went without an auction. Dressler rode out to the property once in the first week of December, which Nora knew because she saw him at the end of the track and watched him sit his horse for a long moment, looking at the place, and then watched him turn around and ride back toward town without approaching. She didn't know what he'd been told or what he'd calculated. She didn't need to know. The fact of his retreating back was enough. Caleb had moved from the barn into the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage since Nora's husband died. She'd emptied it of grain sacks and broken equipment, and he'd patched the wall on the north side where the cold came through and put up a shelf. And that was the entirety of the arrangement. It was not a subject of discussion. It was simply what was practical, and what was practical was what Nora dealt in. And if she lay awake some nights, aware that there was a man breathing quietly on the other side of that wall, who was not her husband, and not a stranger, and was not yet anything she had a word for, well, she'd been managing complicated things for a long time. She could manage one more. Christmas was the first test. She had almost nothing for gifts. She'd known that coming into December, and she'd spent 2 weeks making do. She carved a small horse from a piece of hardwood scrap for Tommy. Restitched Emily's worn coat with better lining she'd traded for pressed wildflowers between pages of brown paper for Grace's collection. Small things. Real things. The kind that required time rather than money, which was the only currency she had in surplus. On Christmas morning, she came out to the kitchen to start breakfast and found 3 packages on the table. Not large. Wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. One with each child's name on it in handwriting she recognized now as Caleb's, cramped and careful, the handwriting of a man who didn't do it often and took it seriously when he did. She stood at the table for a long moment. Then she went to the hall and called the children. Tommy's package contained a pair of small leather gloves, child-sized proper, worked soft, and Tommy put them on immediately and refused to take them off for the rest of the morning, wearing them through breakfast and into the afternoon, until Nora quietly insisted they come off for washing up. Grace's contained a small book. Not new, it had been read, the pages soft with handling, but it was a book of American wildflowers, with illustrations, and Grace turned each page with the focused reverence she applied to things that mattered to her. And she didn't say anything for a full minute, and then she said, "He knew," in a voice that suggested she was adding this to a private record she was keeping. Emily's contained a folding clasp knife with a bone handle. Practical, good quality. The kind a girl who was going to be running a ranch needed and wasn't likely to ask for herself. Emily turned it over in her hands twice. She looked at Nora. Nora said nothing. Emily got up from the table and went to the back door and opened it, and Caleb was in the yard with the morning chores, and Emily stood in the doorway and said across the cold air between them, "Thank you, sir." He looked up. "You're welcome, Emily," he said. She went back inside and sat down and picked up her biscuit and did not make anything of the moment, because she was Emily, and making things of moments was not her style. But something had shifted in the set of her jaw. Something that had been held at a careful distance had moved just slightly closer. Nora watched her daughter and said nothing, and felt something in her chest that was too large and too complicated to name before breakfast. January was brutal the way Montana. January always was, and they got through it the way they got through everything together and without ceremony. Caleb took the harder outdoor work without being asked and without making a production of it. Nora noticed and said nothing about it, which was its own form of acknowledgement. He broke ice on the water trough every morning before the children were up. He reinforced the barn against a blizzard that came down in the third week and would have taken the east wall without the extra bracing. He rode into Harlan Creek twice for supplies and came back both times without incident, though she knew from the way the town was beginning to look at them at the ranch, at the two of them in the general store when she went with him once, that the calculation was shifting. They were being looked at differently. Not with approval necessarily, but with the particular recalibration of a small town that was realizing a situation was not going to resolve the way it had assumed. Dressler stopped coming. Martha Pruitt nodded to Nora on the street, which was a small thing, and also not small at all. The pharmacist asked after Tommy's cough without the tone he used, to use the tone that said "that poor woman and those poor children," and used instead the tone of someone asking after a family that was going to be all right. Nora noticed all of it. She filed it away. She didn't say anything to Caleb about it because she didn't need to. He noticed too. She could tell the same way she could tell most things about him. Now reading him the way you learn to read the ranch, by paying attention to what changed and what stayed the same. In February, Derek Whitmore sent a letter. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope, and her stomach tightened. She put the letter on the table and looked at it for a long moment, and then opened it cleanly, the way she faced most things directly and without stalling. It was brief. His lawyer had reviewed the homestead documentation. There were no grounds for a custody challenge. He wished the children well. He expected to have no further need to make the ride from Billings. She read it twice. She set it down. Caleb came in from the cold and saw it on the table, and looked at her face and said, "Derek." "His lawyer reviewed the paperwork," she said. "He's done." Caleb said nothing. He sat down. He picked up his coffee. "That's over then," he said. "That's over," she agreed. The relief was enormous, and she kept it contained because that was what she did, but she felt it move through her like the first warmth after a very long cold, and she thought that maybe she was learning slowly that some things were allowed to be over, that not everything had to keep coming. Across the table, Caleb was looking at his hands around the cup with an expression she recognized now, the one that meant he was holding something he wasn't sure how to hand to another person. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing bad," he said. He stopped. "I've been thinking about the spring, about what the south pasture could carry if we brought in 2 more heads. There's a rancher outside of—" "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "Ask the actual question," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to put money into this ranch. Proper money. Not as payment for anything, not as I don't want you to think of it as debt or obligation. I want to invest in it because it's worth investing in, and because I intend to be here when it pays off." He looked at her steadily. "But I want to know if that's all right with you. I'm not doing it without you saying yes." She looked at him. She thought about 6 years of making every single decision alone, of never being asked, of the weight of total autonomy, which was not the same as freedom, which was in fact its own particular exhaustion. "Yes," she said. It was a simple word. It landed like something much larger. "Okay," he said, and looked back at his coffee, and she could see the effort it took to keep his face from doing too much with it. She appreciated the effort. She felt it herself. Spring arrived in a rush the way it did in Montana, not gradually, but all at once, like the land had been holding its breath and finally let go. The children came alive with it. Tommy, whose cough had finally cleared completely in the last week of February, spent every waking hour outside in a state of absolute engagement with the world. He followed Caleb through every task with the single-minded devotion of a puppy who had decided on his person and would not be reconsidering. One morning in April, Nora watched from the kitchen doorway as Caleb lifted Tommy onto his shoulders without ceremony. Tommy laughed so hard he had to grab Caleb's head with both small gloved hands and walked the fence line that way, while Tommy called out instructions from above about which posts looked straight and which ones looked tired. She watched them for a while. Then she went back to the kitchen and started on dinner, and let herself feel it, the warmth of it, without immediately thinking about everything it meant or everything it could complicate. Just let it be what it was. A man and a small boy walking a fence line in the April sun. That was enough for right now. That was more than enough. Grace was planting things. She'd been planning it all winter, Nora discovered, keeping a careful list in the small notebook she carried everywhere. What would go where? What needed shade? What could take the Montana spring, and what couldn't? In the second week of April, she went to Caleb with the notebook open and said, "I want to plant something at the old foundation, the burned part at the south end. Is that all right?" The question carried weight they all felt. Caleb looked at the notebook. He looked at Grace. He said, "What do you want to plant?" "Wild columbine," Grace said. "And some prairie clover. And this." She pointed to a page with a sketch she'd made. "This is called fireweed. It grows where there's been burning. It's the first thing that comes back." Something moved through Caleb's face that Nora, watching from across the yard, couldn't fully see, but understood the shape of. He crouched down to Grace's level. He looked at the notebook for a long time. "Yeah," he said. "Plant whatever you want there." Grace nodded with the seriousness of someone who had been given an important assignment and intended to honor it. "I'll need help digging the beds." "I'll dig them," Caleb said. "I'll help," Grace said. "It's my project." "You can supervise," he said. "That's not the same as helping." "You're right," he said. "We'll both dig." They dug the beds together on a Saturday, Grace directing and Caleb executing, and occasionally arguing about methodology in the patient way he argued with all three children, taking them seriously, pushing back where he thought they were wrong, conceding when they made a good point. Nora brought them water and a heel of bread at noon, and Grace was filthy, and Caleb's knees were muddy, and they were both discussing with some intensity whether the fireweed needed more sun than Grace's plan allowed for. Nora left them to it. The moment that changed everything happened in the last week of April, and it happened quietly the way the most important moments did. Nora was in the garden, her garden, the one she'd built from nothing, the one that had kept her children fed through 2 winters, that should have broken her turning the soil for the season's first planting. She was on her knees in the dirt, hands working face warm in the early sun, and she was not thinking about anything in particular. Just the soil, just the work, just the specific satisfaction of ground that had been cared for yielding cleanly to her hands. She heard Caleb come through the gate. He crossed to where she was working and crouched down beside her without asking, picked up the second trowel she'd set down, and started on the row she hadn't gotten to yet. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Then Emily's voice came from the direction of the house, sharp and carrying, "Pa Tommy's got the cat cornered in the loft again. He won't come down." The word landed in the garden like a stone in still water. Nora went still. Caleb went still. Emily, who had stopped in the yard to relay this information and had apparently just heard herself, also went very still. Her face did several things in rapid succession, surprise, alarm. Something that was fighting between wanting to take it back and not being entirely sure it wanted to. "I mean," she started. "I'll get him," Caleb said. His voice was even. He set the trowel down and stood and walked toward the barn without looking at anyone, which was the right thing to do because it gave Emily somewhere to put herself while she recovered her composure. Emily looked at Nora. Nora looked at her daughter. "I didn't," Emily said. "It just—" "Emily," Nora said quietly. Emily stopped. "Go help your brother down from the loft," Nora said. Emily went. Nora turned back to the garden and pressed both hands into the cool soil and breathed. Her eyes were stinging, and she let them sting for a moment, just a moment, and then she pulled herself back together because she had seeds to get in the ground, and the sun wasn't going to hold all day. But something had been named, something they had all been circling for months without the language for. It had been named not precisely, not by anyone who'd planned it, but by a 12-year-old in a yard who'd called out to someone across a distance and used the first word that came to her because it was the word that fit. She heard Caleb's voice from inside the barn, low, patient, a little amused, and Tommy's voice responding, and the specific series of thumps that meant Tommy was coming down the ladder. She heard Emily say something short and clipped. She heard Caleb say, "She didn't mean anything by it, Em." A pause. Then Emily's voice, quieter. "I know." Another pause. "I didn't mind it," Caleb said. "I want you to know that." The longest pause. "Okay," Emily said, one word carrying about 140 pounds of feeling. Nora turned another row of soil and let the sun warm the back of her neck, and did not say anything to anyone about any of it. That evening, after the children were in bed, she and Caleb sat on the front step the way they'd taken to doing in the mild spring evenings, not side by side exactly, but close enough that the night felt shared rather than solitary. "I want to tell you something," Caleb said. She waited. "When I rode up this drive in November," he said, "I was empty. I don't mean tired. I mean there wasn't much left in me that was interested in going forward. I'd been going through the motions of existing for 5 years, and I was very good at it, and it felt like that was what the rest of my life was going to be." He stopped. "I came here to settle an account, a legal one. And then I was going to keep moving because moving was the only thing I knew how to do that felt like doing something." Nora said nothing. "I want you to understand what you did," he said. "Not on purpose, not because you were trying to do anything. You just—" He stopped, and when he started again, his voice was lower. "You fed me beans and told me to wipe my boots, and you didn't treat me like a charity case or a threat. You treated me like a person, and your children talked to me like I was a person, and I did not realize how long it had been since that felt normal." He looked out at the yard. "You brought me back. I don't know any other way to say it." Nora looked at her hands. "You repaired my fence line," she said, "and fixed my barn door, and sat with me at 2 a.m. when my son couldn't breathe." She looked at him. "Whatever I did, you did things too." "I should have been honest from the start." "Yes," she said. "You should have. And you weren't. And I'm still here." She looked at him carefully. "That's what forgiveness looks like, Caleb. It's not a ceremony. It's just still being here." He looked at her. She looked back. "I don't deserve this," he said. "Quiet, not self-pity, just fact." "No," she said. "Probably not." A beat. "Neither do I if we're keeping score. I'm not exactly easy. I've got 3 children and opinions about fence posts, and I will argue with you about the south pasture until one of us is right. I cry at night when I think nobody hears me. I've made every mistake a person can make running a ranch alone, and I'll probably make a few more." She looked at him steadily. "If you're waiting until you've earned something clean and uncomplicated, you're going to be waiting for a long time." "I'm not waiting for anything clean," he said. "I'm done with clean. Clean is what you have when there's nothing worth having." The night settled around them. Somewhere across the valley, something called once and went quiet. "Stay," she said. Not a question, not a command. Something between them that was both. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Good," she said. "The south pasture really does need 2 more heads." He almost smiled. "I know it does. And the barn roof is finished," he said. "I did it last week." She looked at him. "When?" "Tuesday. You were in town." She shook her head slowly, and the thing that moved across her face was not quite a smile either, but was close to one was the expression of a woman who had gotten so accustomed to being the only one holding things together that she still hadn't entirely learned to recognize what it felt like when someone else picked something up without being asked. She was learning. In the morning, Grace planted the fireweed at the old foundation. She did it carefully, seriously, the way she did all things that mattered to her, pressing each plant into the ground with both hands, and murmuring something to each one that Nora couldn't hear from where she stood. Caleb was there too, crouched at the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees, watching. Tommy sat on Caleb's back like he was a piece of furniture, and Caleb did not seem to mind. Emily stood beside Nora and watched her sister work. "Do you think it'll take Emily said. Fireweed always takes, Nora said. That's the whole point of it. Emily was quiet for a moment. He's different than I thought he'd be, she said. When he first came. Different how? Emily considered. I thought he'd be... She stopped. I thought men who showed up at doors were always wanting something. He was, Nora said. He came here wanting something. He just found out it wasn't what he'd thought. Emily looked at her mother. What did he find out it was? Nora looked across the yard at the man who had crouched down at a burned foundation and helped a little girl plant things in the ground where he'd once buried his entire heart, and who was now sitting in the spring sunshine with a 5-year-old on his back, listening to Grace explain the growth cycle of fireweed with the patient attention of someone who understood finally what it meant to be present for a moment instead of moving through it. That he needed somewhere to stop, Nora said. Emily nodded once like this confirmed something she'd been working out on her own. She went to help Grace with the last of the planting, and Nora stood in the yard of the ranch she had built from ruin and refusal, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had never once let the world's opinion of her become her opinion of herself. And she looked at her children and at the man she had fed from her last supply because it was the right thing to do, and at the fireweed going into the ground at the place where loss had once seemed permanent, and she understood with the full weight of a woman who had earned every word of it that this was what survival looked like when it finally stopped surviving and started living. She had carried 3 children through hunger debt and the grinding cruelty of a town that mistook her size for weakness and her silence for defeat. She had repaired what broke and buried what died and planted what needed planting, and gotten up every morning and chosen without ceremony or applause or anyone watching to keep going. She had thought she was waiting for circumstances to change. She had not known she was building something. But that was the thing about building. You didn't always see the shape of it until you stepped back, until a November stranger arrived at your door and looked at what you'd made, and his face told you what you couldn't see yourself, that it was whole, and it was alive, and it was worth coming back for. Caleb Holt had returned to Harlan Creek, thinking he was closing a door. Nora Whitmore had opened one instead, and everything that mattered had walked through it. She had fed a stranger from her last supply, and she had saved them both. And the ranch, this hard-scarred, living, refusing-to-quit piece of Montana ground, had borne witness to all of it, and held it, and would hold it for every season still to come. That was enough. That was everything.